Hi, welcome to our Bible study. A few years ago, I was invited to teach at SIBI, SIBI, the Sunset International Bible Institute in Singapore in Southeast Asia. They asked me to teach on one of my very favorite epistles, the little letter of James. It's a very practical letter. In fact, one commentator called it the blue jeans epistle. And so I was excited to do that. And in preparation for this class, I wrote a little book called James, the Brother of Jesus Speaks. It is still available on Amazon if you'd like your very own copy, or you can just follow along with these video lessons. Let's get right into James chapter 1, beginning with the first verse. Dusk was falling over the narrow stone streets of Jerusalem. It was getting dark, and James was lost in thought. The vendors were closing up their shops as he walked along. Most of the crowd recognized him. On one corner was a Pharisee, and he stood with his cadre of students. On another corner, there was an Assyrian, one of the sturdy people from Nabatea. He shook his head in disgust at the hanging meat in the butcher shop. You see, Assyrian Jews didn't offer sacrifices or eat meat. James was walking through a sea of people from all over the Roman Empire and beyond. Jews of every variety and description were gathering for the festival. Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, Herodians, Essenes, Hermeobaptists who virtually bathed every morning before their prayers, Nazarenes from the Transjordan, Zealots, Galileans, and more. James turned down a dark alleyway and knocked on a familiar door. The servant girl greeted him with excitement, offering him a basin and a towel to wash his feet. She knew he would prefer to wash them himself rather than have a servant tend to his needs, but she was happy to see the brother of Jesus, even if he didn't require her services. The Galilean thanked her, dried his feet, and walked up 2 flights of stairs to a large attic room spanning the whole house. It was large enough for their evening meeting. Already others had gathered, including some families who had taken refuge here, fleeing persecution in their neighborhoods. It was a particularly dangerous time to be a follower of the Christ. James was just as happy to see the disciples as they were excited to see him. He talked with them, listened to their stories, and often shook his head sympathetically. Others were still arriving. Most were poor, shopkeepers, merchants, and laborers. Soon the room was crowded. The ceiling was low, and the windows were opened wide, offering some relief from the stale air. A few of the women were still hesitant to join the assembly and preferred to tend the children in the back of the room, but other women eagerly listened as the scriptures were discussed. Surely this must be the end of days, everyone agreed. The prophecies are being fulfilled. We must live pure and holy lives. After a long prayer asking for boldness, protection, and comfort for those who had recently lost their homes, James began. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 read, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." 2 words are used in the New Testament that are translated by the English word patience. The King James Bible often translates the first Greek word, macrothumia, appropriately as long-suffering. It is the kind of patience that endures trial by hanging on. Many struggles require just this kind of patience. We are expected to do no more than endure faithfully to the end. Peter said, God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. God's patience is our word, macrothumia. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. The second word is hupomone, and that is the word James uses here. Your faith produces steadfastness. Rather than waiting, enduring, hupomone thrives in the face of adversity. Paul said, quote, he will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. You see, Romans chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, hupomone is an active virtue. Perhaps the difference between the two types of patience is illustrated in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Their thin, colorful lichen cling to the rocks. In the summer, the unfiltered sun beats down on them, and in the winter they are buried beneath the ice. Still they hang on, they endure. But often beside the thin yellow lichen, if you get down on your hands and knees, you will find the mountain forget-me-not. A tiny flower as brilliant as anything in your flower garden. The mountain forget-me-not has a yellow center, bright as the sun itself. The heart of the flower is surrounded by deep, iridescent purple petals. 9 months out of the year, the mountain forget-me-not lies buried under the snow and ice. And for the other 3, the sun beats down relentlessly through the thin atmosphere on the high mountains. But this tiny flower doesn't just cling to the rocks like its distant cousin. It thrives in the face of adversity with a brilliance that takes your breath away. That is hupomone, a prized virtue not easily earned. The Apostle Paul told the Romans, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces, here's our word, endurance. And endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Romans chapter 5, verses 3 through 5. Likewise, the Hebrew writer says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run, here's our word, with endurance, the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, here's our word again, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated on the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured, that's our word, from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. One of the men looked at James with tears in his eyes. But brother, we've lost everything. How can a loving, just God allow this to happen to us? He pleaded. James looked at him with love in his eyes, nodded in sympathy, and then told them all. James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. James 1, verses 5 through 8. When Jesus moved to Capernaum, along with his family, John chapter 2, verse 12, James lived beside the Sea of Galilee. The lake sits 600 feet below sea level and is surrounded by hills with an opening in the northwest corner of this mountain bowl. When conditions are right, the winds from the western Mediterranean Sea roar through the gap, swirling the lake into a maelstrom. Rather than marching across the water in orderly progression, the waves of the western whips, or so they're called, come crashing chaotically from every direction. James says a person who doubts is just like that. One minute they believe, and the next they doubt. That person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. James chapter 1, verse 6. Then James coined a brand new word in the Greek language to describe such a person. He is DIPSUCHOS, literally a man with two souls. The word is so vivid, Clement of Rome at the close of the first century uses it in his letter to the Corinthians to describe Lot's wife. First Clement chapter 11, verse 2, 23, verse 2, Second Clement 11, 2, and then the author of the Shepherd of Hermas, another early Christian writer, is also very fond of this new word. Of course, Lot's wife wanted to be saved, but she also wanted to stay in the cosmopolitan city of Sodom. Her heart was torn. Her mind was divided. She was DIPSUCHOS, and so perished. James told his listeners two conditions must be met before they could understand their painful circumstances. First, they must not doubt. They must not be DIPSUCHOS. And second, they must ask in faith. There are two ways of asking questions. One of them is noble, and the other is not. Sometimes we ask questions in a way that isn't looking for an answer. It's really just an accusation. Why didn't you? In that case, the person isn't seeking understanding. They are questioning motives. This kind of question is rooted in doubt. Why did you do this? You must have some ulterior motive. However, we can also ask questions honestly, searching for deeper understanding. Questions asked this way are expressions of faith, and they're noble. This kind of question is based on belief. James promises God will answer that kind of question. Think about it this way. God answers all of our prayers. Sometimes he says yes, and sometimes he says no, and at other times he tells us to be patient. When God says no or wait, we often wonder why. A person who doubts the love of God may answer the question for themselves with an accusation, God said no because he doesn't love me. Or worse, because God can't. That accuser cannot expect God's blessing. On the other hand, a person of faith will ask, Lord, help me understand why this is happening to me. He knows God is in control, and he never doubts God's love. He's simply asking for wisdom. James promises God will provide understanding in that case. Let's pause for a minute, and I'd like to share some questions. I'd like you to think about these, and I believe that they will help you grow. As we go through this series of lessons, the questions will have three parts. The first one will be involved with knowledge. The second will help us deal with our attitudes, and the third will help us in our actions. This is called the KAA plan, knowledge, attitude, and action. So our knowledge questions this week, the first one is, why is patience a key to fruitfulness? You can look at Luke chapter 8, verse 15 and Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 for help. 2. What qualities do the Proverbs say lead to patience? See Proverbs chapter 14, verse 29 and chapter 19, verse 11. How are these characteristics related to patience? 3. What is the difference between patience, makrothumia, and endurance, hupomone? Which one is harder? 4. Why is patience essential for healthy relationships? And 5. Why does Paul say patience is the first ingredient in love? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 7. All right, let's take a look at our attitudes. Question number 1. Since true patience is a, quote, calm endurance based on the certain knowledge that God is in control, James Rye, how could acknowledging God's power over your circumstances help you be patient in dealing with your career, your ministry, your relationships, and hardships? 2, let's think about why are patient people so attractive? 3, how would your life be different if you were more patient? Finally, let's think about our attitudes, our action rather, this week. In what area of your life is patience most difficult right now? Consider what you need to do to exercise faith in this situation and write out a prayer to use this week to help you grow. God bless everybody. We'll see you next week.